Hello, and welcome to the first episode of How This Ad Works. I'm Jason Fox, or as many of you may know me as, Lee Clow's Beard. If this is your first time realizing that Lee Clow's Beard is not authored by Lee Clow himself, such is life. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Let's get on with it, shall we? So, as I said, this is the first in a series, possibly the last in a series. We'll see how this particular first episode goes, in which I explain how an ad works. Why? Why should I do this? Why does anyone care? Well, within the industry, we like to talk amongst ourselves about the work. When it comes to the bad work, we are quite adept at tearing it apart. We poke it, we prod it, we rip apart the cliches, we point out the poor editing, the bad color choices, the lame ideas, etc., etc. We are, collectively, and pretty much to a person, myself included, quite good at that. But when it comes to the good work, we often share it, and we celebrate it, and we say, this is awesome, it was funny, it moved me, the music was great, I really liked the style, the direction, the color choices, all those things. But we rarely get down to the real nitty-gritty of why one ad, from a production standpoint, is better than another. What is it about the executional aspects that took a good idea and kept it good, or made it even great? That's why I'm doing this. Now, what I'm going to do is discuss things like structure, genre, tone, characters, direction, editing, the writing, all those sorts of things for this particular spot. For other spots, that might include color grading, music choices, all the things that coalesce into a whole and make something good. What I'm not going to do is discuss strategy. So we're not going to debate whether the strategy for the ad was good or bad. We're talking about the piece of work. Also, I'm not going to debate whether or not a given ad was appropriate for the brand at the time that it ran. We're going to pretty much assume that if something has stuck around and been venerated over a decent period of years, it was probably a pretty good idea for the brand to have done it. Sometimes that's not always the case, but we'll give folks the benefit of the doubt, any evidence notwithstanding. So let's get to it with today's very first ad. I've chosen one of my favorites, a favorite among favorites. It came out around 1999 to 2001 or so. If anyone has the exact dates, feel free to comment. And it's the Mark Harvey campaign for Holiday Inn, produced by Fallon out of Minneapolis, or as I still like to call them, Fallon McElligott. Without further ado, let's roll that beautiful bean footage.
Mark, why is Grandma eating off the ironing board?
Why not?
This is a kitchen table, not a desk.
It's both now, and Dad's got a schedule for that.
Dinner's at 11.
Ish.
Mark, you go work in your room.
There's no desk up there, and I can't stay awake. I just get in bed, it's like, out.
Would you like a room with a nice big workspace?
Great.
What's this look like? A Holiday Inn?
Hey, Grandma.
Want a room with room to work? Holiday Inn gives you more, and more is better.
So there you have it. Room to Work from the Mark Harvey campaign. As I said, one of my favorites. The campaign as a whole did win a Gold Effie in 2000 for effectiveness in the travel and tourism category. So in this case, we do know that the ads and the campaign as a whole worked. Let's begin with structure. Now, structure is tied often to genre. If you have a certain genre, an action film, a thriller, a comedy, all these things, they start to dictate a certain structure. Now, if you adhere to that structure too closely, things can become stale. Likewise, if you venture too far afield from the structure that a genre dictates, it could confuse people. In this case, you're dealing with Holiday Inn, and they are using a sitcom structure for the spot, and they hew closely to that format. So it becomes endemic upon the writing and the casting and the performances to pull it off, because the structure is not novel within its genre. Now, you might be thinking, how is this a sitcom? it's 25 seconds before we get to the end tag. That's a pretty tiny sitcom, and that's true. But break it down real briefly here. The conflict, which every good story does have to have, even whether it's a funny conflict, a serious conflict, there has to be some sort of conflict within the story that gets resolved, that brings conclusion and catharsis to the viewer. Without it, it's just someone spouting at the camera like me. Mark, the son, wants space. So we've got our conflict. Secondly, we have the cast, which is a family, which is very common in sitcoms. Family matters. Modern Family. All in the Family. And finally, the family dynamic is, of course, dysfunctional. Why? Because happiness in comedy is boring. But why is it important that this spot sticks to this sitcom structure and that it uses this sitcom structure? Well, there are a couple of reasons. By sticking to the tropes, when someone spots this and identifies it as a sitcom, which they do pretty instantly because they're familiar with how the camera moves operate and the way dialogue is, used, they know they're in for something funny, or at least they hope they're in for something funny. But the spot doesn't have to sell itself on its structure. It announces right off the bat something odd is going on with the very first line from Mom. Mark, why is Grandma eating?
Mark, why is Grandma eating off the ironing board?
Secondly, because people know what they're supposed to be getting, the spot doesn't have to waste time drawing people in and wasting their mental energy figuring out what's going on. Other structures do lend themselves to this as well, but most people don't get terribly excited about seeing another montage or a chotty. If you don't know what a chotty is, here's an example.
Are you a copywriter?
Or an art director?
You need a script.
But don't have a concept?
We've all been there.
You either pull an all-nighter
Or just slap together a chotty.
For years, chotties have allowed advertisers to say anything.
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 Exactly. Tone. Now, the tone of this spot is, I would describe it as absurd realism. Now, remember, this spot is 20 years old, came out just a couple of years after Seinfeld ended, and you can definitely see the influence of Seinfeld upon it and the absurdist reality that exists in this little world. You can see the events as being possible, but probably not working out exactly in this way. After all, if people actually did have this predicament, it would be a 10-minute conversation that devolves into a shouting match, which would then give you an after-school special starring Christy McNichol, but not a very comedic spot, which, good for Christy, but less so for Holiday Inn, probably. Characters. So, in 25 seconds, we are introduced to 4 characters and learn enough about them to understand some of their motivation, their characteristics. We can empathize with their plights. There's not really a character arc per se because it is 25 seconds, but we still have a grasp of these characters and are more invested in them, I would say more so than many modern major motion picture events. So we have Mom. And you can tell from her hard-heeled steps that start the spot that she's a no-nonsense kind of lady. She's got her retired school teacher outfit on. She expects her husband to be pouring coffee for her. She's the smartest person in the room, and she is Mark's main antagonist in both this spot and throughout the campaign. Now, Dad is a bit of a cipher here. He is obviously not the bumbling idiot dolt, but that we often see in both sitcoms and in TV commercials. If the image of James Belushi just popped into your head, I apologize for that, but you are spot on. Instead, Dad just kind of acquiesces to whoever is the strongest personality in the room at the time. So before this spot starts, that would have been Mark. And we know that because Dad has apparently agreed to Mark's new dinner and dining table usage schedule. But as soon as his wife walks in, he's Team Mom all the way. Grandma. Grandma's a hoot, of course, because that's, usually what grandmas are. Grandma does seem that she could have, hopped on her hover-round, scooted off the set of The Golden Girls, hopped in a time machine, and ended up on the set of The Spot. but not quite. She's not sassy or sexy or sophisticated or a little bit dim, and she's only somewhat spunky at the end. She's just there to witness the comedy that ensues between Mom and Dad and Mark, and she gets a kick out of it. And that's funny. And finally, we have Mark, the son. Mark is portrayed by comedian Ross Broccoli, who today lives about 50 miles away from me running an organic farmstead. It's true. Mark is quite the character in every sense of the word. Unable, or more likely unwilling, to go out and get a real job, yet he'll go through all sorts of complicated machinations to demand things from his folks that he believes he deserves just for existing and living in their house. But he's not your garden variety burnout. He's not trying to hide his very special hydroponics project from the olds. His main ambition is to remain ambition-free. And yes, I learned all of that in 25 seconds, because that's good characterization and good writing. Writing is, of course, the most important part of any project. That's a bit of a joke because, if you don't know, I am a writer, and I approve of my own efforts. But in spots like this, the writing really does have to be tack sharp. I mean, I would argue that the writing should always be tack sharp, but in some ads, the writing being a little below its best gives you 95% of a great spot instead of 100%. In the case of something like this, if the writing's off, you go from 100 to about 15%, just like that. You don't want that. I'll be honest, I don't know how much of what we see in the finished product was in the client-approved script and how much was maybe fiddled with or improvised on set, but given the structure that we're dealing with the sitcom and the beats that you have to hit, there's not a whole lot of room because you need certain shots, you need certain timings, and this, that, and the other. Now I can see them playing around quite a bit probably with the line where Mark says,
No desk up there, and I can't stay awake. I just get in bed, it's like, out.
but I don't know. We don't know. Nonetheless, it had to start with some great words. And if you count them out, which I did, not including the ending tag, there are only 68 words of dialogue in the first 25 seconds. 68 words. That is some economic comedy. There's no filler in there. Now, some of you may be familiar with screenwriting and argue that the opening line that Mom says,
Mark, why is Grandma eating off the ironing board?
commits the sin of telling, which is exposition, versus showing, which is action. And normally that would be the case, because in longer form pieces, you should always try to show a character's motivation and what's going on, as opposed to just telling people. There's a reason why Austin Powers had a character named Basil Exposition. But in this case, we need Mom to provide that prompt for a couple of reasons. First of all, we need the viewer to know immediately that Grandma is sitting at an ironing board. She's not at the kitchen table. She's not at a side table. She's not at a little TV tray or anything. She's at an ironing board. And that's hard to get just by viewing. You don't want people to have to try and puzzle out and solve what that thing is that Grandma's at. Also, by Mom saying this line to begin the spot, it grabs people's attention because it's odd. If I'm sitting there watching a show and starting to, doze off or drift away or get up and go do something else, and I hear the question, why is Grandma eating from the ironing board? I will stop, because who doesn't want to know why Grandma is eating off the ironing board? People who hate fun, that's who. I am not one of those people, and neither are you. I'm not going to go line by line for the rest of the spot, even though it's relatively short, but do take a moment, go back and watch it, and notice how every line has a purpose. It furthers the narrative, it drives the conflict, or it helps resolve the conflict, or it adds some comedy, which is important. There's no fluff. There's nothing there that shouldn't be there. And that's what we should strive for in everything we make, especially advertising, and especially this video, and I apologize for failing miserably at that. Now, the ending joke, what do you think this is? A Holiday Inn? They end every spot on that joke. But it works every time. One, because it's organic. It leads up to that in a believable way. Also, we're watching an ad, and we know we're watching an ad. We expect some sort of advertising to actually occur, some mention of the product. And also, what do you think this is, a Holiday Inn, is a play off of other similar retorts that have entered the general lexicon, like, who do you think you are, Mario Andretti? If you don't know who Mario Andretti is or what that line represents, I apologize for being old. Now then, we've been talking about the product a little bit, and let's keep going on those lines. Note how the product feature is built into the spot. It's not just built into the spot, actually. It's the foundation for the spot. It's not shoehorned in. It's not kind of obliquely referenced. It doesn't come out of nowhere with annoying voiceover because the previous 20 seconds was a bunch of borrowed interest that forces you to make a mental leap from that to the product. It's the foundation of it. Everything is about that one feature. One feature. Let me see that again. One feature. And because of that, they can craft this whole narrative around it, and it works, and it sells it beautifully. Finally, a bit about direction and editing. When reviewing any type of filled entertainment, I tend to lump direction and editing together, not because they're the same discipline, they are not, but because they are so interwoven in the final project that it's often difficult to separate the direction from the editing if you weren't on set. It's hard to construct a good edit and a good finished product from poorly directed footage. And similarly, great footage can be ruined by a bad edit. They go hand in hand in something we like to call
Synergy.
Thank you, Topher. In the case of this spot, the direction is neither stylistic or flashy, and that is on purpose, and it is a good thing. Remember, we're dealing with a sitcom structure. There's no shaky handheld work, whip pans, or dolly zooms, things that can actually work in different genres, but that would not be the case here. The case here would be to draw attention to the technique and away from the story, and we don't want that. Instead, the director is using well-established beats and setups and things that people know, not to make something generic, but to make it instantly understandable. Editing. Now, with editing, it requires a lot of skills, a lot of technical skills and a lot of artistic skills, and not everyone can bring both sets to the table. To me, great editing comes down to focus, shot selection, and timing. First of all, what are we wanting people to focus on? What character? What emotion? What action? What do we want to draw their eye and their minds to? Then, what shots do we need to use to pull that off? Finally, what's the timing of those shots? Do we linger on one shot to bolster tension or to draw out humor? Those combined then form a rhythm. Great editing and great work always has its own fantastic internal rhythm. And even if people cannot describe that rhythm, they know when it's off. We all know when it's off. We all know when you're just sitting there going, oh, get on with it. Those sorts of things. I'll give just one example of a great editorial decision within this spot. You'll notice right after Mom asked the question, and I mean right after, the very next frame, they cut to a wide two-shot of Mark and Grandma at the table. And it's a full side view of the table. It's not the three-quarter shot that we usually see in the rest of the spot, which tends to foreshorten the items on the table and, compact that, because by then we're focused on the character and not the table. In this instance, though, we get to see what Mark has wrought upon the table. He has shoved all the decorations that were on the table off to the left and sprawled his office paraphernalia in front of him. It's a great way to show that he's only thinking of himself. He just doesn't care. He's going to do what he thinks he needs to do to get whatever weird work done that he wants to get done. And perhaps more importantly, by taking this time, this break of just a second or so, we see that Mark is perplexed that Mom would even ask such a question. Obviously, Grandma needs to be eating there because he needs the table. So by creating this pause, it makes his response all the more funnier. Now, would the spot work if we cut that scene out?
Mark, why is Grandma eating off the ironing board?
Why not?
This is a kitchen table, not a desk.
Yes, it does work, but it doesn't work as well. So, shave 2 seconds off the end tag and keep that spot in there because it's worthwhile. It ups the entertainment, it ups the effectiveness, and it's a great thing to do. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I could take an even deeper dive and waste more of your time. I go into set decoration, which is spot on. I could talk about the random pug in that table scene that I just mentioned, or I could go on about the nice use of the music in the ending tag. But I won't. I mean, I kind of just did. You can go back and check those things out and try and think for yourself about why these things work so well. So anyway, thanks for joining me on this very first episode of How This Ad Works. I hope to do some more in the future, and if you have any ideas for work that I should feature, feel free to drop me a line at lcb@leeclousbeard.com. It can be one of your favorite spots, it can be a classic spot, it can be a spot that you've been told is a classic, but have never been able to figure out why people like it so much, and have maybe been too afraid to ask others for fear of ridicule, which never ever happens in advertising. Nor does it have to be a TV spot. Print, radio, outdoor, anything. If it's great, it's up for grabs. So until next time, treat each other well and keep fighting the proliferation of mediocrity. I'm Jason Fox. Have a good one.